Welcome to The Actioned Woman. This is the space where awareness stops being conversation and becomes responsibility, where survival gets questioned, systems get examined, and purpose becomes the compass of a life. We look at the structures shaping how people live, and then we decide how we are going to live inside them. An action woman does not wait for the world to reorganize itself around her. She begins reorganizing her life around what she knows must be built. Take a breath. Step into the work. You are not here by accident. Something in you is ready to move with intention, ready to rise, and ready to build. I'm Raquel, and this is The Actioned Woman. There are moments in a person's life when the surface of things no longer explains them well enough. The routine is still there. The responsibilities are still there. Work continues, family continues, the ordinary shape of life continues. But underneath all of that, something quieter begins to form. It is not always dramatic, and it's not always easy to name. Often it begins as a growing sense that the direction of life has been inherited more than chosen. A person starts noticing how much of their movement has already been arranged for them. What to want, what to pursue, what to measure, what to call success, what to call freedom, what to call a meaningful life. These ideas arrive early and with so much repetition that most people never think to question them. They begin accepting them as reality. Set goals, work hard, build the career, earn more, keep moving. These instructions are handed to people as though they are self-evident truths. And when they are followed, the rewards often come quickly enough to keep deeper questions quiet. Approval, progress, recognition, a sense of movement, something close enough to meaning that it rarely gets examined. That is where I want to begin today. I want to begin with the question underneath the language people have been taught to admire, because none of the quietest forces shaping modern life is the way goals have been positioned inside it. Goals are rarely treated as simple markers of effort. They become direction. They become identity. They become the framework through which people learn to measure their value. And the moment a person starts examining goals this way, something more unsettling begins to appear. Not all goals belong to the same category. They do not all serve the same end. Some keep systems functioning, some keep survival intact, and some, the ones people are often taught to dismiss, postpone, or reduce, belong to something deeper. Purpose. That distinction matters more than most people realize. If a person cannot tell the difference between the goals that maintain a structure and the goals that nourish a life, they can spend decades moving with discipline and still feel disconnected from where that movement is taking them. They become highly skilled at performance while remaining unfamiliar with purpose. They can become useful without ever becoming whole. This is one of the central tensions shaping modern life. It shapes how people work, how they build families, how they understand ambition, how they relate to money, how they carry responsibility, how they interpret exhaustion, and how they define freedom. This conversation, it matters deeply to me because I do not believe people are confused because they are incapable. Many are trying to find clarity inside systems that were never designed to make clarity easy. The messaging is constant. The incentives are strong. The pressure is unrelenting, and the rewards are immediate enough to keep deeper reflection from ever feeling necessary. What I want to do in this episode is slow the conversation down and look carefully at the structures shaping modern ambition. I want to look at the way systems direct human energy through goals, the way survival can quietly become a permanent state of life, the way purpose has been devalued, dismissed, or treated as unrealistic. I want to look at the way women in particular were moved from one form of restriction into a more complex form of extraction and taught to call it empowerment. I want to look at the way men and women have been pulled further from one another while both remain shaped by structures neither fully designed. And most of all, I want to look at the way all of this begins to shift when a person starts examining life through a purpose-led lens. Once that lens appears, the conversation changes. It becomes less about doing more and more about seeing clearly enough to live differently. That is where wiser stewardship begins. Once a person starts really examining their goals, the question is not only what they are working toward, but where that direction came from in the first place. Most people were never really taught what a goal is. They were taught that they should have them, set goals, work hard, move forward. That message is so normal, so familiar that most people never stop to ask a harder question. Where did those goals come from? And maybe even more importantly, who do those goals actually serve? When you slow this conversation down and really look at the goals shaping modern life, something starts to become very clear. Goals are rarely neutral. They do not just help organize effort, they organize direction, and direction is one of the most powerful forces in a human life. Most people think they choose their goals they are pursuing. But when you look more closely, a lot of those goals were introduced long before they were ever examined. They came through culture, school, work structures, and the expectations people inherit around success. From a very early age, people are taught a simple formula: set goals, work hard, achieve more, move forward, repeat. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. Effort matters, discipline matters, responsibility matters. But what matters just as much is realizing that not all goals exist for the same reason. Some goals exist because systems need them. Economic systems need productivity. Corporations need measurable output. Institutions need people moving in a predictable direction. So goals become one of the main ways human energy gets directed towards those ends. That is simply how large systems function. They reward the behavior that helps them operate. Over time, those rewards shape culture. People learn which goals are respected, which goals are praised, and which goals are treated as valuable. Once you see that, another question starts to come forward. If so many goals are designed to serve systems and so many others are designed simply to keep life going, then what goals actually serve a human life? Those are purpose-led goals. And once you can see the difference between those three levels of goals, it becomes very hard to keep organizing your life the same way. Part of the reason people feel so conflicted around goals is because goals are usually talked about as if they are all the same. They are not. They serve very, very different functions. And once that becomes visible, a lot of modern life starts making more sense. The first category is system goals. These are the goals that keep large structures functioning. Corporations rely on productivity. Institutions rely on measurable progress. Economic systems rely on people continuing to work, produce, compete, and expand. So naturally, the culture around those systems reinforces the goals that help them grow. Promotions, scaling, climbing ladders, performance metrics, recognition. These are all rewarded because they strengthen the structure itself. There's nothing inherently wrong with system goals. They make certain forms of progress possible. What matters is what happens when they stop being one part of a life and start becoming the main force shaping it. When that happens, a person's time, energy, and even identity can start organizing around maintaining and advancing within the system, often without much reflection on what that direction is actually building in their life. The second category is survival goals. These are the goals tied to living itself, paying bills, providing for a family, maintaining a home, raising children, keeping life stable. These goals carry weight. They require effort, consistency, and care. There is dignity in them. They are part of stewarding a life responsibly. At the same time, survival has a very specific effect on a person. When someone is living close to survival pressure, most of their energy goes into keeping things afloat, protecting what they have, and preventing loss. In that state, there is often very little room left to step back and ask deeper questions about direction. Not because the person lacks awareness, but because their capacity is already being used to sustain what is right in front of them. For a lot of people, life becomes a constant movement between the first two categories, system goals and survival goals, working, maintaining, responding, and repeating. And when that rhythm goes on long enough, something else can begin to fade. The third category is purpose-led goals. These come from an entirely different place. They are not driven mainly by productivity, and they are not driven mainly by survival. They come from a deeper sense of what a life is meant to build. The values a person wants to live by, the relationships they want to create, the contribution they want to make, the part of themselves they feel called to develop, protect, or express. Purpose-led goals affect a life differently. They do not just help a person do more, they help a person understand what their life is in service of. They give meaning to effort. They give coherence to sacrifice. They create orientation. And without that, a person can be productive, responsible, and even externally successful and still feel strangely disconnected from their own life. Because productivity cannot replace purpose. There is also something important to understand here. Purpose can begin from a place that feels grounded and personal, clear, honest, steady. But over time, it can start getting shaped by the same expectations that define system goals. A person starts asking whether it is producing enough, growing fast enough, visible enough, recognized enough, monetized enough. And once that happens, something shifts. What once felt steady starts to feel heavy. What once gave direction starts to feel like pressure, not because the purpose itself has changed, but because it started being measured by a system it was never meant to belong to. That is where confusion deepens. A person may still believe they are pursuing purpose, but the experience of it begins to feel strained, heavy, compressed. They start pulling away from the very thing that once felt meaningful, not because it had no value, but because it no longer feels like something that supports their life. That distinction matters. Purpose-led goals are not meant to be governed the same way system goals are. They require a different kind of stewardship. They are not always meant to produce immediate return, and they are not always meant to be measured through external validation. Their role is to shape a life from the inside out. This is where the deeper tension begins. When a person starts organizing their life through purpose, they begin asking very different questions. They look more honestly at how their time is being used. They question whether constant productivity is actually enough. They ask what all of their effort is ultimately building. They begin approaching work, relationships, and responsibility with a different level of awareness. And once someone begins moving through life with that level of awareness, they become much harder to direct unconsciously. Once you start separating goals this way, the world begins to look different. Survival goals are everywhere. System goals are constantly rewarded. Entire industries exist to keep them moving. But purpose-led goals are rarely spoken about with that same urgency, usually because they sit outside the machinery organizing modern life. And once you start looking closely at that machinery, another pattern begins to come into view. The way men and women have been positioned inside it, not just recently, across generations. Because the way a culture organizes work, family, responsibility, and ambition tells you what the culture really values. And when you follow those patterns over time, something becomes quite clear. The form of control has changed more than once, but the structure guiding people's lives has rarely disappeared. It has just been repackaged. For a long time, women were restricted from full participation in economic life. Their opportunities were limited. Financial independence was difficult. Many were confined to the domestic sphere, carrying the labor that kept life moving, raising children, managing the home, cooking, cleaning, tending to the daily rhythm of family life. That work mattered deeply, but it was often invisible and it carried very little structural power. Many women depended on marriage for stability and survival. Those limits were very real, and many of them needed to be challenged. Men, meanwhile, were confined in a different direction. Provision, security, economic production. the pressure of carrying financial survival for a household. So the deeper truth is that both sides of the structure were incomplete. Women were largely confined to maintaining life. Men were largely confined to funding life. Neither role reflected the full range of being human. When women began entering the marketplace in greater numbers, that mattered. It challenged something real, but what followed did not always deal with the deeper problem. Instead of redesigning life more fully, a second structure was layered on top of the first. Women were told to enter the marketplace, build careers, build businesses, lead, compete, produce. The language around it was everywhere. Empowerment, independence, self-sufficiency, and in many ways, that did open doors. But something else happened at the same time. The structure around women did not reorganize in equal measure. The home was still there. Motherhood was still there. Emotional labor was still there. The invisible work of holding family life together was all still there. What changed was that another full system had now been added. The marketplace, professional productivity, economic competition. Two full systems were now drawing from that same person, work and home. Human beings can endure a great deal, and women have shown that again and again. But when two systems keep pulling from the same reservoir without a real shift in shared support, something predictable begins to form. Exhaustion. This is where the conversation needs to become more mature. The deeper issue was never supposed to be a war between sides. It was never meant to become one person carrying a whole world while the other carried a different one. A healthier structure would have required shared stewardship across the whole of life. Women understanding finances, men understanding the responsibilities within the home. Both people able to participate in the full structure of building a life. When both people understand the whole, something changes. There is more awareness, more respect for the weight the other person carries, more ability to make decisions from understanding instead of assumption. Partnership starts to mean something deeper than divided roles. But that is not where the culture settled. Many of the narratives that followed centered conflict, burden, and position. Strength became closely tied to independence. Dependence became something to avoid. And partnership slowly moved out of the center of the conversation. Many women were quietly pushed toward a model where strength meant carrying everything: career, home, income, children, emotional labor, life management. At the same time, many men were left trying to understand where they fit inside a structure that had changed without clearly redefining their place in it. The result was not balance. It was confusion. And underneath that confusion, another conversation began disappearing. Purpose. Something else was shifting alongside all of this, not just in how people lived, but in how they began to understand meaning. Purpose was no longer experienced simply as something that guided a life from within. It increasingly became something people felt they had to show, shape, prove, or turn into something externally valuable. And once that way of thinking takes hold, even the most personal parts of life begin getting pulled into that same logic. The things that once grounded a person begin getting measured through output, visibility, growth, and return. So over time, purpose itself starts to change in a person's hands. What once felt internal starts to feel performative. What once felt steady starts to feel pressured. What once gave direction starts to feel like another demand. And when purpose fades this way, the effects do not stay abstract. They begin showing up in the homes raising the next generation, because a generation is not shaped by ideas alone. It is shaped by the atmosphere inside the homes that formed it. The silence, the strain, the expectations that were never named and still taught everything. That atmosphere leaves marks. For many in the baby boomer generation and in the generations around them, life was organized around stability through work. The script was clear. Work hard, provide for your family, secure a home, be responsible, keep life moving. There was dignity in that model. It built neighborhoods, it built industries, it gave people structure. But inside many homes, the lived reality was more layered than the script suggested. Roles were often clearly divided, but that did not necessarily create wholeness. In many homes, women were managing the home and contributing economically while still carrying much of the internal weight of family life. What was often missing was not effort. It was shared understanding. And when shared understanding is missing, pressure inside a household does not usually create connection. It creates strain. Parents exhausted by work, mothers carrying the invisible burdens without real support, responsibilities divided but not truly shared. When life is organized around expectation without relational awareness, something begins eroding beneath the surface. Connection. Many families remained intact in structure, but emotionally, they were often stretched thin. Children were cared for, homes were maintained, but the deeper relational life of the household was not always strong. And children grow. They grow inside that environment. They absorb tension. They absorb the silence. They absorb the distance. So a generation grew up watching adults carry enormous responsibility while also being shaped by the strain of the structure they were living inside. That imprint does not disappear. It moves forward. What children witness becomes part of what they understand about work, family, relationships, and purpose. At the same time, the wider fabric around family life began to weaken. Communities weakened. People moved for work. Extended families became less connected. Neighborhoods became more transient. Families increasingly found themselves carrying life in greater isolation, less shared support, less shared responsibility, more pressure concentrated inside the household. And when internal strain meets external isolation, the effect multiplies. Families become more fragile. Parents carry more with less support. Children grow up with fewer points of stability. Millennials grew up inside that very environment. They inherited the structure. They also inherited the evidence of what that structure produced. They saw responsibility. They saw sacrifice. They also saw fatigue and distance, a quiet sense that something underneath the surface was not fully working. And gradually, a question began forming. Is this the only way a life can be organized? Once that question becomes clear, it does not stay passive. It becomes something a person must answer through how they choose to live. Because what gets inherited is not only roles, it is the emotional cost of how those roles were lived. And sooner or later, someone begins asking whether the structure itself was ever whole. That is where the return to purpose begins. A question like that does not appear by accident. When a generation starts asking whether the structure itself was ever whole, it usually means something deeper was felt long before it was ever spoken. Millennials did not wake up one morning and randomly decide to challenge the direction of life that came before them. They grew up inside the evidence of it. They watched their parents work relentlessly to maintain stability. They watched homes held together through endurance more than ease. They watched communities thin out as work pulled people farther from the place they once called home. They watched adulthood begin earlier and feel heavier than it seemed to for the generations before. At the same time, the economy itself was shifting. The cost of living keeps rising. Housing is becoming harder and harder to secure. Starting a family requires more financial stability than many young adults can reach quickly. People started working harder just to reach what earlier generations had reached with less strain. And when survival becomes more expensive, something happens to a culture. Energy narrows. People spend more of their lives managing the immediate and less of their lives reflecting on the deeper direction of things. Systems built around productivity function most smoothly when people stay focused on survival and performance. And when people live inside that rhythm long enough, something else becomes harder to reach. Purpose. Purpose requires space. Purpose requires reflection. Purpose requires the ability to step back and ask what a life is actually meant to build. Those questions become harder to hold when every day is consumed with maintaining stability. Many millennials began feeling that tension very clearly. On one side, the old expectations of success were still there. Build a career, secure income, move up, get stable. On the other side, something in many of them resisted organizing an entire life around those goals alone. They had seen what survival and system goals had produced in the generation before them. Security, yes, but often alongside exhaustion, distance, and a quiet absence of deeper meaning. This is what sharpened the awareness. Survival goals are necessary, yes. System goals are often unavoidable, but neither one can replace purpose. When left unexamined, survival and system goals begin organizing life by default. They burn people out. They narrow emotional capacity. They drain time and energy until a person starts relating to life through depletion instead of direction. And when people live too long inside those pressures, the effects do not stay at work. They spill into everything. Patience gets thinner, resentment grows, anger grows. The people and places a person loves most begins carrying the weight of what that pressure has taken from them. Partners turn on each other. Families start competing instead of working together. Home stops feeling like refuge and starts absorbing the stress of survival. That is why this conversation cannot be reduced to money alone. Economics shape the emotional climate of a life. They shape families. They shape relationships. They shape whether people have the space to be present, creative, and connected, or whether they become exhausted, guarded, and overwhelmed. A life organized entirely around survival and system goals eventually begins turning a person against the very things they once said they were working to protect: the partner, the children, the home, the community. That is one of the deepest reasons purpose matters. Purpose does not remove difficulty. It prevents difficulty from hollowing out the meaning of a life. Purpose is the orientation that lets all the other goals fall into place. Without it, ambition becomes endless motion. Work becomes accumulation without meaning. Success becomes something that still leaves a person quietly wondering why they feel empty once they get there. So a generation began searching for something different. Not simply success, not simply independence, something that would make the work of living feel meaningful instead of mechanical. That search has taken many, many forms. People questioning traditional career paths, people redefining success, people sensing that a meaningful life has to include more than productivity alone: family, community, creativity, contribution, spiritual direction, some deeper coherence holding it all together. A meaningful life rarely grows out of survival goals alone. Survival and system goals tend to organize life around performance, competition, and constant movement. They reward output, they reward comparison, they reward individual advancement. And over time, people can begin living in ways that separate them from what actually make life strong. Scarcity thinking grows. Competition grows. People begin choosing in ways that quietly weaken the very structures that help human life thrive. Purpose moves differently. Purpose is not simply personal ambition. It is rooted in something deeper: values, moral direction, the kind of life a person believes is worth building. Purpose strengthens family. Purpose deepens community. Purpose gives creativity, contribution, and spiritual direction coherence. It allows those parts of life to grow instead of forcing them to fight survival for oxygen. This is why purpose-led goals feel different. They do not remove responsibility. They organize responsibility around something deeper than productivity alone. These questions are often dismissed as unrealistic, but many times they are signs that something deeper is happening inside a culture. A re-examination of purpose. Because once people begin recognizing the difference between survival goals, system goals, and purpose-led goals, they begin living differently. They still work, they still provide, they still contribute, but those actions begin serving something beyond the system itself. They begin serving what a person is consciously choosing to build. That changes the relationship people have with ambition. It changes how they measure success. It changes how they build families, communities, and lives. Purpose will not remove responsibility. Purpose gives responsibility meaning. And when a generation begins reclaiming purpose as the compass of life, the whole conversation around goals begins to change. No longer is it just about climbing. No longer is it just about surviving, but about building something that reflects the deeper direction of a human life. And purpose, it does more than change the direction of one life. It begins reshaping the structures around that life. Relationships change. Priorities change. The way a home is built begins to change. Because once purpose becomes the compass, survival and system goals no longer hold the same authority. People begin asking better questions. What kind of partnership allows a family to thrive? What kind of home allows purpose to grow instead of suffocate? What kind of community allows human life to feel whole again? Purpose does not pull a person away from responsibility. It pulls responsibility closer to the center of life. A purpose-led life does not remove motherhood. It deepens it. It does not remove partnership. It strengthens it. It does not remove community. It rebuilds it. And when those structures begin rebuilding around purpose instead of survival alone, something powerful becomes possible again. Homes become places of direction instead of exhaustion. Partnership can become cooperation instead of competition. Families can become places where purpose grows instead of disappears. That is where the conversation has to go next. Because if purpose is the compass of a life, then the structures built around that life need to start reflecting it. And at the same time, not everyone is building those structures under the same conditions. Some people are raising children alone. Some are inside partnerships where responsibility is uneven or absent. Some are rebuilding after relationships that damage trust, safety, or stability. Some have chosen not to build families at all. Often, others are navigating adulthood on their own. These realities here matter. They reveal something important about the moment we are living in. The structures that once distributed responsibility have weakened. Many people are carrying the weight of life with far less support. So if purpose is the compass of a life, a harder question emerges. What does purpose look like when the structure around a person is strained, incomplete, or missing? Purpose is not a grand project reserved for ideal conditions. It is the orientation that shapes how a person chooses to live inside the conditions they actually have. A single parent may not be able to reorganize life overnight, but they still shape the emotional climate of the home. They still shape what their children inherits. They still shape what patterns end and what patterns continue. Someone rebuilding after a broken relationship may begin in quieter ways, refusing to repeat destructive patterns, rebuilding trust in themselves, learning the difference between solitude and isolation. These are not small decisions. They are structural shifts in the direction of a life. And for those not building traditional families, purpose still takes form. Community, contribution, creative work, mentorship, leadership, a life that carries meaning even when it does not follow one expected shape. What matters is not whether a life looks traditional. What matters is whether a person continues stewarding that life through purpose instead of defaulting entirely to survival. This is where purpose-led goals become essential. Goals give direction to purpose. They translate values into lived action. Purpose-led goals do not require perfect conditions. They require clarity about what a person is choosing to build from this point forward. That clarity keeps hardship from defining the entire direction of a life. So instead of asking not only how to endure, a different question begins to emerge. What kind of life am I building through the choices I am making today? And over time, those choices form the trajectory of a life. That trajectory is not determined by perfect conditions. It is determined by whether a person keeps orienting toward purpose. Recognizing this matters because it removes one of the most common ways people distance themselves from purpose. The belief that purpose has to wait until life gets easier. Purpose does not wait for perfect structures. Purpose begins shaping the structures that are possible right now, inside the conditions a person is actually living in. A person may not control every condition around them, but they still have influence over how their life is being directed and what their actions are in service of. And that is where the conversation turns from understanding to responsibility. Because once a person begins seeing the difference between survival goals, system goals, and purpose-led goals, something shifts. They are no longer simply living inside a structure. They are now participating in how that structure continues. And from there, a different question begins to emerge. Not only what do I understand now, what am I going to do with what I now see? There comes a point when a person can no longer keep living inside a structure without asking what it is doing to their life, what it is shaping, what it is taking, what it has slowly taught them to accept as normal. And there also comes a point where continuing the same way stops being neutral. It becomes a choice, whether that choice is conscious or not. Because once you begin seeing the difference between survival goals, your system goals, and purpose-led goals, we begin to shift. And we are no longer just moving through life the way we were taught. We begin to see that our time, our energy, our effort are always being directed somewhere. We are always building something, whether that is intentional or not. And that is where responsibility enters the conversation differently. It enters as awareness, as clarity, as the understanding that how we are living is shaping the direction of our life, even in small ways. Survival goals keep life functioning, food on the table, bills paid, a place to live. They all matter. They carry weight. For many people right now, that weight is heavy. System goals organize how work, time, and effort gets used inside larger structures, careers, productivity, performance. That is real too. But when a life becomes organized almost entirely around those two forces, something else will begin disappearing: our purpose. And when purpose is missing, a person can be doing everything required of them and still feel like they are disappearing inside the life they are maintaining. This is where I want to speak carefully. There are people hearing this who are carrying pressure that feels constant: financial strain, responsibility, decisions tied tightly to survival. For some people, even hearing a conversation like this can feel distant, unrealistic, or meant for someone else. That feeling makes sense. The pressure is real. The exhaustion is real. But this is also where purpose is often misunderstood. Purpose does not arrive at the end of struggle. It lives inside the life you are already in. It belongs to the conditions you are living through now. It begins there. It begins with noticing what is already happening and deciding, even in small ways, to move with more awareness. Because even in constrained situations, there are still places where a person has direction. They may not feel large. They may not change everything immediately, but they are real. The way you respond instead of react, the things you keep feeding with your attention, the patterns you begin questioning that you used to move through automatically, the moments where you stop participating in something you already know is building nothing meaningful. That is where a life begins to turn. And there is something else that needs to be understood clearly, because this is where so many people lose their connection to purpose without ever realizing why. There is a deeply reinforced belief that anything meaningful in your life must eventually become measurable, that it must make money, become visible, grow into something larger, or justify itself through output. So once that belief takes hold, purpose gets pulled into the same system it was never supposed to serve. It starts being measured through the wrong way, pressured the wrong way, and over time, it starts draining a person instead of grounding them. People begin thinking that if something really matters, it should also become productive. And when it does not, they quietly move away from it. They deprioritize it. They leave it behind. They disconnect from it. The issue is not lack of meaning. The issue is the lens being used to judge it. Purpose-led goals exist outside constant extraction and measurement. They are what you build because they matter, because they shape who you are, because they strengthen your life, your relationships, and your contribution in ways that cannot always be quantified. Some of the most important things a person will ever build do bear fruit over time, but their value was never meant to be measured only by speed, visibility, or output. The way you raise your children, the way you repair what was broken in your family, the way you show up in your relationships, but also the things that are more personally yours. The way you create when no one is watching, the art you make, the way you write, cook, move, design, or express something that feels like you. The time you spend developing something that may never become income, but brings you back into yourself. The way you take care of your mind, the way you build your body, the way you allow joy to exist in your life without needing to justify it. None of these things are secondary. They are, in fact, foundational. And when these parts of life are allowed to exist without constantly being measured or turned into something else, something changes. They begin giving a person a kind of meaning that cannot easily be taken from them by the system, by circumstance, by doubt, once it has been fully lived. That is why purpose must be protected. Because the moment everything must produce, a person begins losing the very thing that would have steadied them. And underneath all this, something deeper keeps repeating. It is the belief that power sits somewhere outside of us, that it belongs to systems, institutions, or people in positions we may never reach. So over time, people begin living inside that belief. They begin moving as if they have no real say in that direction of their life beyond maintaining it. That is where the deepest harm begins. It begins in the moment a person stops seeing themselves as someone who can still direct something. Because the truth is, your power is not gone. It is being handed away in the way a life is lived, quietly, repeatedly, in what gets accepted without question, in the patterns that continue without awareness, in the moment where a person assumes they have no choice and stops looking for where they still do. Suffering becomes most dangerous when it convinces a person to surrender, when it tells them that this is just how life is, that nothing can change, that there is no space to move differently. That is the moment where everything begins to close. And that is also the moment where something, even if it is small, has to be chosen differently, deliberately, steadily, with awareness. Because the work is to reclaim power in how you live. From there, the next steps are about becoming more deliberate with what is already there. It begins with honest reflection, looking at your life as it is being lived, where your time is going, what is taking your energy, what you are saying yes to without really examining it. Looking at your goals and asking, which of these are purely survival? Which are shaped by expectations I never actually chose? Which, if any, are aligned with the life I want to build? And just as important, what have I continued even though I already know it is building nothing for me? The next step is redirecting, taking small pieces of your day, your attention, your decisions, and placing them with intention instead of letting them be pulled in every direction. One decision, 1 hour, one pattern at a time. This right here is how direction is built. And over time, those decisions begin changing what is being built in your life. The way you approach your work, the way you relate inside your home, the way you choose your relationships, the way you carry responsibility. This is where goals begin changing too. Maybe not in how many you have, but in how you relate to them. Instead of asking whether something looks successful or productive, you begin asking What is it actually building in your life over time? And that question, answered honestly, changes more than most people expect. As that begins to shift, something else becomes clearer. A life organized around purpose is built through connection. Even in difficult conditions, there is still a movement towards relationships that are cooperative instead of competitive, towards support instead of silence, toward building something larger than one person trying to manage everything alone. That is where change actually happens. It begins in how people start organizing their lives differently within the structure they are in. And that matters more than it seems, because the direction of a life does not change all at once. It changes when a person stops waiting for something outside of them to change first. And that always begins the same way, by deciding that survival and external expectations will no longer be the only forces directing your life, and beginning, even in the middle of pressure, to move through the lens of purpose. A life does not change through awareness alone. It changes in the moment a person decides to stop participating the same way they always have. Purpose is not something you wait to feel ready for. It is something you begin organizing your life around, even while everything around you still feels unfinished. An actioned woman does not spend her life studying what is broken without deciding what she will build instead. She sees clearly. She takes responsibility for how she lives inside it, and she moves in a way that begins shaping something different, even if it starts small, even if no one sees it. This is where most people will hesitate. This is where they tell themselves, it's too much, too late, too hard, too far gone. This is also where most lives remain unchanged, because the direction of a life is not decided all at once. It is decided in what you continue, what you question, what you stop, and what you choose to build instead. So this is not about finding a different moment. It is about recognizing the one you are already standing in. This moment, this life, these conditions. What you do next is not separate from your life. It is your life taking shape in real time. This is the Action Woman, and from here, you do not return to not knowing. You decide what happens next.